Hello everyone. Welcome to our meetup for Accessibility New York City tonight. This is our June meetup. Excited to have our presentation tonight. I wanted to start off by thanking our sponsors. First, you're in the lovely ThoughtBot office. We've got Tyson here in the back, ThoughtBot, and they are our event hosts in our event space, and we're very appreciative of always being able to have our monthly meetup here. We've also got Level Access that sponsors the captions, the real-time captions that we have being displayed here. And we always graciously appreciate their support each month. We've got Jolly McPhee from the Internet Society, New York. And we are broadcasting on YouTube as we do all of our events. So if you're unable to come in person, every meetup is live streamed with the live captions displayed as well. Very excited for our topic tonight. I actually live in Williamsburg, so I'm someone understanding transportation challenges just from my perspective with the L train shutting down. Obviously, we have lots of perspectives, lots of things to think about. I think this is one of the most important issues here in New York City to be considering. So really happy to have Jessica Murray here today to present to us about her research and understanding of what we're facing in New York City. Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks, Thomas. This is my favorite meetup in the city. I just have to say, it's probably the only meetup I actually attend regularly, so I'm really super excited to be here. And thank you all for coming tonight. So I'm a student at the Graduate Center. I'm in my fourth year of a PhD program there in developmental psychology. And I'm still learning about all the transportation challenges that people with disabilities face when they're trying to get around the city. And I'm learning a lot about different types of disabilities besides just wheelchair access. So tonight I'm just going to tell you kind of what I've learned so far in some of my research up until this point. I'm also working on my dissertation proposal this summer, so this is actually a really great opportunity for me to get feedback from you to kind of help develop my research ideas for my dissertation. I'm also the co-chair of the CUNY Disability Scholars Network. This is kind of like an informal network of professors at all of the CUNY campuses, and we meet once a semester and try to foster disability studies at CUNY. And being involved in this group has really kind of expanded my awareness of disability issues. And I'm also an advocate for making transportation more accessible. This is probably my most favorite design that I've ever made. And I'll talk more about advocacy later at the end of the presentation. Some of my fellow advocates are in the room, so thank you all for coming tonight. So I'm going to give you a little bit of my background. I don't want to make this whole thing about me, but I think having a little context of where I'm coming from is useful because people tend to ask why I'm interested in this topic. And so the part of the story is that I grew up in Texas, which is very different than New York. I grew up outside of Dallas in a kind of semi-rural area. So as a child, I kind of had limited mobility. I was driven around everywhere. I could walk and take a bicycle to some extent, but for the most part, I was very auto-dependent even as a child. And of course, when I grew up and turned 16, I got my driver's license like everyone else. And I hated driving. I absolutely hated it. It just was not really a favorite thing for me. I don't like being next to aggressive drivers on the highway. I did not like being stuck in a car driving around Texas. And so when I went off to college at UT Austin, I gave up my car and I was really excited that I could actually take a bus and get around. And I could do that to some extent. I had some help from friends in Austin because you can't get everywhere with the bus. And as part of when I was in school, I received a travel scholarship and got to go to Switzerland and saw their amazing transit system. And then that's when I kind of fell in love with public transportation. So I was, what the kids now are calling a transit-oriented teen. I don't know if anyone has seen that meme. I really fell in love with it. I had a brief stint working with Capital Metro, designing some materials for a bus route that would be for tourists visiting Austin. And I hoped that it would turn into a career there, but that didn't really work out. I moved back to Dallas, bought a car, worked there for about 5 years, became kind of a design jack of all trades, learned a lot of different graphic design skills, finally got fed up with driving and then moved to New York. So that was about 10 years ago that I moved, and I worked here in New York City for about 5 years before I decided to go back to school. And part of what prompted my return to school, and actually my move to New York City, was becoming diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. So in 2005, I had my first kind of major symptoms of multiple sclerosis, and half of my body went numb on the left side. I couldn't really feel the sensation of my skin. I didn't really know what was happening. I saw a doctor, and he said, we have to do some tests to see if this is what you have, but maybe you should sit down at my computer and read what multiple sclerosis is. And he left me in his office for about 20 minutes so I could read all about everything that could possibly happen to me now that I may have MS. And he said, you should just wait and see, it'll go away. And, this is different for everyone. So if it happens again, go see a doctor, get an MRI, get some more tests, and then get diagnosed. So I waited a few years. It went away. In 2008, it came back, and I had my second kind of major relapse. So I got officially diagnosed and decided, what am I doing with my life? And, kind of up and moved to New York about 6 months later. Fast forward 3 years after I got here, I had another major relapse, and that's kind of what prompted me to go back to school. I was working in marketing, but I was not very fulfilled or satisfied, and I wanted to make a change in the world. So I applied for the environmental psychology PhD program at CUNY. I got denied. I applied for the master's program and got accepted, and so I did a master's there first, and then applied for a different psychology program, and that's where I'm at now. So I'm going to show a short video that I made in my very first class. This was a class called Supportive Settings and Restorative Environments. And I had to convince my professor that the subway was a supportive and restorative environment. It took some convincing. So I edited this video down from the full 10-minute presentation. So if there's some weird edits or jumps between ideas, that's why. So I cut out about 6 minutes, and I won't subject you to the whole presentation. It took 4 months to save $3,000 to buy my first car. Can you hear that? My second car was about $9,000, and I financed it over 5 years. In 2008, I sold it for $4,000 and moved to New York City. I've never felt so free. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it has captions too. I fell in love with New York on my first visit in 2004. The pace of the city was exhausting but exciting. The sheer size and density was mind-blowing, and the capital of the world pulled me back again and again until I finally moved in 2008. The subway provides true downtime between work and life activities, allowing for introspection and engagement with people and media, and it does it safely. The subway also provides physical health benefits. Time spent driving is directly related to higher levels of obesity. Walking just a mile a day to get around the city adds up to walking 10 marathons a year. Overall, New Yorkers enjoy a 2-year longer life expectancy than the national average. The Transit Authority has been integrating art into the architecture of the subway for over 25 years now, and has brought a sense of place to the individual stations. The beauty of the permanent art is that it preserves the original feeling of the subway while incorporating details of the city above. Permanent and temporary artworks have brought the healing power of art into a distressed place and changed it for the better. "27 years after the introduction of the Arts for Transit program, the subway has become a destination. supporting not only the 8 million residents and 50 million annual visitors, but also a rich cultural underground. The Arts for Transit program has become its own institution. New York Times author Randy Kennedy calls it the most underrated art museum in New York City. The social landscape of a highway can be fraught with isolation. Over time, aggression from other drivers becomes the only memorable interaction you have with people on the road. I haven't been flipped off by anyone in the 4 years I've ridden the subway. Not to say it never happens, it just isn't part of my everyday experience. And while a commute on the subway can become routine, there's more than a good chance you'll encounter someone or something new every day. There's a certain stimulation lacking from driving that comes from social contact with strangers. Observing their differences, making eye contact, overhearing conversations, and sometimes even having a conversation, even if it is just to give directions. The subway for me is an escape from an even more taxing environment, and an escape to any number of destinations in the city. The subway has evolved into a series of niche environments that can foster feelings of belonging to something bigger. Meaning, action, and social contact in this context can bring more restoration than we realize. An obvious flaw of the subway is its lack of accessibility. While it's making progress, today only a quarter of stations are ADA compliant. The original builders of the subway imagined a sophisticated place that would make commuting seem dignified. Over the years, the MTA has made improvements to cars to make them more comfortable and durable. Letting the system fall into a state of disrepair has had negative effects, but keeping thousands of cars and miles of stations clean is a Herculean task, one that NYC Transit estimates would cost $100 million per year. While the subway can use some work, it still gets good reception from locals, transplants, and tourists who rely on its support. Even necessary trips can surprise and offer restoration from unexpected sources. I, for one, will continue to look forward to my next trip. Okay, so yeah, that was kind of me at the beginning of my graduate school experience. So I went on to write this thesis, work-life experiences for people with mobility disabilities in New York City. And that part about the subway not being accessible really stuck in my head. Simi Lenton actually came to this class. I don't know if anyone is familiar with her work, but she writes about disability language, and she had a really big influence on my research after that point. So for my thesis, I interviewed about 10 people, most of which were wheelchair users in New York City. And I conducted about 10 hours worth of interviews and kind of tried to understand all of the various things in their lives that were impacted by their disability. And so my kind of guiding framework was this developmental psychologist, Bronfenbrenner, and he had this idea of ecological systems theory where, we're kind of in the middle of all these different systems, and even something that's kind of outside of our immediate world can impact our daily lives pretty profoundly. So he had a really boring concentric circle design, and I designed this much more complicated diagram, with all the, these microsystems are kind of like your individual environments. We travel from place to place. Our home is probably our most important micro environment, but, there's home and school, work, health and care had a really big part of people with disabilities' lives. And then there are other kind of characters in there that also influence their day-to-day life. So, maybe they have a personal care attendant. That person can bring in energy and affect their lives from day to day. And, I think the interest for me was kind of looking at how these local and federal policies actually really impact how people are able to live their lives. And transportation was one thing that came up that was extremely important and sensitive topic to most of the people that I interviewed. I think it was probably the most important part of their lives, or it took up a lot of their energy because of the many issues that they encountered just trying to get around. And so that, it has like all these other effects on being able to attain education and get a job and et cetera, et cetera. So the first paper that I published came from these interviews, and I was looking specifically at Accessoride because, hearing the stories of people's transportation challenges was enough to let me know that, yes, I'm on the right track. Transportation is something that I should continue to study. But hearing Accessoride stories were just like, out of the park with the kinds of challenges and difficulties and horror stories and just so much emotion involved in this process of just trying to get from place to place. So I took the very small number of Accessoride narratives. There were about 25 of them. And I did a very deep analysis of those narratives. And I also looked at kind of the MTA's policies and the Americans with Disabilities Act policy related to Accessoride and paratransit. So the type of analysis I used, this is all qualitative research, is called narrative analysis, and I did 3 different types of analysis. So the first one was a plot analysis using the user stories, a values analysis looking at the policy documents and kind of how those values play out in people's daily lives, and a systems analysis, which I'll explain a little bit more. So plot analysis is basically based on the idea that we communicate in stories, and so even in everyday conversation, we're telling each other stories. Something happened today, I want to tell you what happened, and so there's usually something that starts the story. If it's a very polished story, there's kind of things that complicate and lead up to this high point, and then it kind of gets resolved, and then there's the end to the story. In conversation, these stories are not nearly this, this neat. So sometimes the complicating actions and resolution strategies are in different places. So it's a lot of work to go through and identify which ones are which, and then you have to get another researcher to kind of verify that you're both seeing the same thing. So for the high points, there were 25 narratives and 25 high points, and the most common ones were people expressing anxiety and frustration. And then the second most common ones were, kind of just like saying that it is what it is, and this is the choice that I have, or choosing like a different mode of transportation. Complications and resolutions, I also categorized those, and the types of complications were that, for a lot of people, Accessoride was literally their only choice, and the alternative was always much worse. So if Accessoride took 2 hours to get someone somewhere, well, the bus and the subway and the unknowns going along with that would, it could take longer, and there could be, this risk of getting stuck in a subway station, or, not being picked up by the bus because it's already full and having to wait half an hour for the next bus. So that was the worst, the most frequent type of complication. But people are resilient, and their resolution strategies were proactive, so they would go out of their way to try to fix the problem. But there were about twice as many complications as resolutions. So for the values analysis, there's kind of 2 different types of values that you can find in people's statements. You have the explicit values, where people are pretty much putting out there what they think, So this is an example from the MTA's paratransit, kind of guidelines, FAQs. So they're saying, you will not be reimbursed for a taxi or car service if we determine that you're responsible for the problem. So that's pretty straightforward and direct, and conveying their values pretty clearly. And then there's implicit values, where there's, you kind of have to read between the lines. So this is another example from the MTA. Pickup time, in quotation marks, is the time you wish AAR to arrive. And that's almost like a little bit, I don't know how to describe that. It's a little bit like they're saying, oh, we know that we're never going to get there on time, so we'll just like make light of it. And, that's kind of like this kind of implicit thing that they're saying. So for the 3 narratives that I used for the values analysis, there's this section in the ADA that describes what paratransit is and what's required. And then the MTA has a page about Accessoride, and the section that I analyzed was, what to do if an Accessoride vehicle is late. And then I chose one kind of representative user narrative that kind of kind of neatly encompassed what a lot of other people have been saying. Yes.
What's the amount of time that's considered late or under that?
Oh, that's half an hour.
Can you also say the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. So Thomas was asking, what is the amount of time that a driver can be late where it's considered late? So they have to be more than 30 minutes late for it to be considered late. And in their official policies, you're not supposed to even call until it's been half an hour past your pickup time. So as you can imagine, that's pretty frustrating for people. You know, I basically found about 6 values that were kind of shared among some or all of the narratives. And it basically came down to people with disabilities having rights. Denying service is discrimination. MTA is responsible for providing service to people with disabilities as a public entity. Paratransit is expensive. It's not really a value that we would necessarily hold close, but it's something that came up in the MTA policies a lot. Also that paratransit kind of exists in the real world, so problems are going to happen, and that individuals are ultimately responsible for their own mobility. So you can kind of see where some of the values are missing. And then for the systems analysis, it's also kind of a close reading to understand the characters and settings in these different kind of systems. So you look at characters for micro systems, it's kind of family members, maybe your personal care attendant, your friends, your doctor, et cetera. The meso system, I don't think I really explained, but it's kind of this interaction between microsystems. So say, for instance, your partner has a terrible boss at work, and he brings that back home with you. So that's part of this mesosystem that still impacts your life. And then for exosystems, you know, these are kind of third-party characters with limited contact with the person. And for macro, it's kind of like larger institutions, lawmakers, decision makers, stuff like that. So a couple of examples for complications and resolutions. You know, for micro, it could be, you know, I was afraid to take public transportation. And then if they try to resolve that, well, you know, what can I do? I just try to relax. If I'm on an accessoride and it's bumpy, that's the only thing I can do to resolve it. You know, accessoride drivers will take you the long way. So this is kind of moving between the microsystems again. And people resolve that by kind of adding more time to their pickup time so they don't lose their appointment of where they're going. Another example complication for the exosystem would be, you know, this other person who's not really in your immediate environment. This accessoride driver is supposed to pick me up, but he's in Queens, so you know, what am I supposed to do now? Accessoride were supposed to organize another pickup for me. And then for macro, it's kind of looking at like society at large. I think other cities would be worse because everything's so far away, or they would be better off putting money into improving the subway. Could be a resolution for the macro level. So when I kind of combined these and compared them all together, basically I saw this pattern of problems kind of originating outside of the micro level, but then being resolved on the micro level. So there's a lot of kind of unresolved issues in the narratives, and for the most part, it's people internalizing frustrations, you know, and just kind of living with the stress that comes with trying to get around. And then when you kind of look at the values analysis using the same ecological systems framework, you see that the user is more focused on their micro needs, but they can see the whole picture, the exo and the macro, whereas the MTA has kind of lost a little bit of touch with the macro, the big picture of rights and not discriminating against people. And the ADA is a little bit more balanced, but with a little bit less attention paid to the individual. So yeah, looking at some of these complications and some of these values mismatches, you can kind of make policy recommendations based on what the most frequent complications are. And you know, it's not really that difficult to kind of come up with some ideas to alleviate some of the issues that people are experiencing. So I'm not going to go through each one of those policy recommendations, but yeah, so you can find that paper online. If you want to read the whole thing, email me and I'd be happy to share it with you. So that kind of brings me to the current research project that I've been working on. This kind of represents like a little bit of a shift in focus, trying to go from like, well, first of all, qualitative analysis is really tedious and really hard. And you know, I was kind of have been taking a lot of statistics courses and kind of interested in big data and like, yeah, GPS data. Was looking at all these kind of travel studies that I thought were interesting, but searching for a data set out there that would have some variables dealing with disability, and you'd be shocked to find how few there are national travel surveys, even regional travel surveys, that don't even ask the question as a demographic variable. Or if they do ask it, it's like, do you have a disability, yes or no? Okay, well that's not really that useful because, you know, as we all know, disability is so varied. So this also kind of coincided with you know, this kind of broadening interest in different types of disabilities. I was involved with a disability colloquium at Columbia University, and my co-chair's brother, his name is Josh Mealy, and he lives in the Bay Area. He's totally blind, and he's this really brilliant kind of hacker type person. He's basically figured out how to get his hands on any kind of information he wants from a young age. He teaches people how to do Arduino, other blind people how to do Arduino. He's a really interesting guy, and he was really the kind of the first totally blind person that I've interacted with on that level. And so we kind of chatted about a number of accessibility things, and so the panel was about kind of trying to theorize access and how we can move it forward. And so we talked about kind of a culture of accessibility and this creating awareness and understanding among culture at large. Also being a specialist versus a generalist. So I had been focusing on mobility disability pretty much for most of my research. It's easy to understand. It was easy for me to empathize with because of my own experience with MS. And it's easy to see like where the problems are and where the frustrations are. But there's kind of all these other accessibility problems that have not even really gotten any attention. Like, for instance, there's not public address systems in about half of our subway system, or our subway stations. So any blind passengers trying to use the subway, or I'm sorry, blind passengers trying to use the subway, I don't know what I'm trying to say. The information is not getting to people. We're not really presenting the important information that people need in multiple formats. So there's a lot of issues that are kind of under the surface that have never been addressed. Some other motivations for the project are, you know, like I said, this isn't really given much consideration in general transportation studies. I know about that moods can kind of spill over from family and work environments, but we don't really know much about how transportation affects our moods or spills over into those two environments. You know, GPS technology offers a lot of potential for collecting data and for awareness of mobility patterns, but a lot of studies use proprietary and expensive software. So if you wanted to do a study where you're collecting GPS data, you can either develop your own app or buy an app or rent it to use, but most of those are not cost effective, especially for someone who's attending a public university. And a lot of the data sets that I was able to find, they're used for planning purposes. They don't collect qualitative data, or they don't ask questions that I think are interesting. So ourmobility.org is basically trying to use free tools that are already out there, that people have already developed, that people are somewhat familiar with. So I'm using Google Maps Timeline and PACO, which is a qualitative personal analytics companion. So anyone can download and create their own experiments with this app. And I'm kind of drawing on this idea of like the quantified self or citizen science, where people are trying to collect their own data about their own behaviors and analyze their own data. But they don't really have a lot of tools to look at this kind of data. But Google Maps Timeline kind of offers a little bit of that. So back in March, I conducted a pilot or feasibility study. And so my main research question was, is it possible to collect high-quality location data and travel diaries using only free tools? And so some of my other questions, were that I was developing this process and trying to make it easy to use and understand for a lot of people, and also to identify accessibility issues. So a couple of other questions were, what is the ideal frequency of diary entries? I gave people the choice to do a 1-time-a-day survey or a 3-times-a-day survey. The 1-time-a-day survey had all the same questions. It just asked, what times a day did you travel? And they would have the same set of questions for each time that they answered. I also wanted to see if I could get some rich data, so a range of experiences, travel, challenges, and emotions. And then to see if providing people with a report of their mobility would encourage them to participate. So I spent a lot of time developing the website and used some tools that I learned here actually to make the website easy for people with cognitive disabilities to understand. So I used HemingwayApp.com, which will tell you what grade level you're writing at. And when I decided to kind of take another look at my website, I realized that I was writing at a 16th grade reading level. So I think if you spend too much time in academia, you just kind of start to write in this like totally inaccessible way. And so I was trying to add more information to make it more understandable, but I realized what I needed to do was to take away more information to make it understandable. So I started out with a page or a website that had, 5 or 6 different pages. I condensed it all into basically one page with a couple of other pages for different resources, and shortened everything to be about 1,000 words. So basically this was the flow chart for the study. I had about 375 people visit the site in 2 weeks. 67 people filled out the screening form. I was looking for 20 participants. 58 filled out the demographic survey, and then I selected 20 based on that, and I oversampled people with disabilities just to get their insights, but this is something that I'm going to be doing going forward too when I do a fuller study. So the steps were, once they were selected, they would install Google Maps and turn on their location history and edit their timeline if something came up and was incorrect. And then they would do this survey, this PACO survey, either once a day or 3 times a day. And then after that data collection was complete, I created a very basic mobility report for them, and then followed up with a focus group and a follow-up survey. So this was kind of this screening and selection process. It was basically 18 and older New York City metro area resident with a smartphone and a computer with internet. I asked them questions, like basic demographic questions, disability questions, and a few transportation questions. So these are some screenshots of what Google Maps timeline looks like. So if you enable your location history, you can start tracking your history, and you're the only person that can see it. And if you want to share it with someone, you can download a file for each day. The nice thing is that you can edit the modes of transportation. So it's actually, you get pretty good data back out of it, and this interface is already really well designed, and they've already put a lot of money into it. And then these screenshots are from the PACO app. So basically the questions that I was asking, besides the kind of what mode of transportation were you using, what was the purpose of your trip, who were you traveling with, I also wanted to specifically ask about obstacles and challenges. And there's room for open-ended questions about, what kinds of obstacles did they encounter, how did they deal with it, how did they feel after their trip, why did they feel that way, and then, a space for memorable experiences. And this is kind of just a brief overview of the mobility report. So it would show a map of all of their travel within the week, and some charts that show their mood fluctuations depending on mode of transportation, companion, etc. So for the feasibility study, these were some of the kind of questions I was looking for. And I think I did pretty well on making things easy to understand and use. Luckily, the tools are well designed, and most people had an easy time using most of the tools. A few people, I gave them the option of me creating a Gmail account for them so I could download the files. So that's why the orange not applicable is on the KML files. But for the most part, I think it was pretty successful in that front. As far as data completion, this was a whole week of data for doing surveys either once a day, 3 times a day, and also downloading and saving the Google Maps data. So also pretty good. I was happy with the results.
Wait, am I interpreting this correctly? The 3 times a day?
Handing the mic over to
Oh, I'm sorry.
is thanks.
So I just want.
Is it on? Press.
Looks like it's on.
Oh, yeah. Try now.
No.
Try now.
Trying. Okay. So just looking at this, it looks like the 3 times a day was completed more than 1 time a day.
Yes.
So
So this is how many people completed each step at least 7 days or fewer than 7 days. So about 83% completed at least a week of the 3 times a day survey. So yeah, not bad. And then this is kind of shows the data quality. So the total trip entries for the 1 time a day versus the 3 times a day. Well, the 1 time a day survey, people reported more trips, but the descriptive and memorable experience entries were a lot higher for the 3 times a day. So yeah, I think it's kind of like I get better quality with the 3 times a day survey, but I get better, like more complete data. But I think since I have the maps data and the PACO data, so it may be better just to have the 3 times a day, but people also preferred the 1 time a day, and a lot of people said I would forget to do it if it was that often, or I would get tired of doing it, so I may keep the option open. I'm still deciding. And then this kind of shows the, like, per participant, the kind of data that they submitted. So some people were very descriptive in their answers, and some people were less so. And then when I was also wanting to know how the mobility report affected their participation, or how it would affect their participation, because I told people they would get a mobility report, but I didn't really show them what that meant. So it was kind of the first time that they had seen it, and a lot of people, it was kind of split, about half and half. Found something that was surprising, would be motivated to participate for longer if they were going to get reports like this on a regular basis. Some people reported that they would try to change their behaviors based on seeing their report. And this was anything from, I want to take more active modes of transportation because I noticed that I'm happier when I use my scooter, or, I'm going to, just try to change something up. I noticed that, like, one person had small children at home, and he said that one thing that he noticed was he was always in a bad mood when he was traveling with his kids because he had to lug their stroller up and down the stairs, and he didn't realize how much that affected his mood until he saw this report. So I think there's some value in doing that, and I hope to refine it for the future full-scale study. So I did run into a few technical challenges. Onboarding was difficult, especially for first-time Google Maps users. If they had never used it before, it was hard. Different phone operating systems have hidden application settings, so I thought Android phones, okay, here's the instructions, you do this and this. Well, Samsung has their own extra setting for turning on location history that I had no idea about. And this was true for iPhone and for 2 other kinds of Android phones. And then battery life issues, people, I think, even though they've fixed some of those issues with Google Maps, a lot of people would not turn on the kind of always on feature. So that could change the data quality a little bit too. And then for methodological challenges, we saw that some people didn't fill out enough surveys, but some people filled out too many surveys. So, about a third of the people didn't correct any of their missing mode information. If Google Maps is unsure of the mode of transportation you're using, it'll just say moving. So some people just left it at that. PACO doesn't have a way to edit diary entries. So when I first started kind of tallying up like how many diary entries people were filling out, it was like some people were filling out 4 a day, and I just couldn't figure out how that was happening. But I realized that they were doing duplicate entries when they wanted to add something to their entry. And a few people who reported that they had a disability didn't experience any transportation challenges at all, so I need to kind of refine the questions that I'm asking about transportation and disability and make them more specific. The focus groups were really good. I got some good feedback. A few people wanted to know how the transportation costs affect their mood, if they had to take an unexpected Uber or cab ride, what kind of mood they would be in because of that. Another person wanted to know, to see like a follow-up to the obstacle and delays question, like what could have prevented this delay, what needs to be fixed. And another person wanted to know how long how the trip length might affect someone's mood. And weather was also brought up. Since this was in March, there was at least one day where there was a lot of snow and rain, and it was like a pretty miserable day to get around for everyone. As far as motivation, advocacy was mentioned by a couple of people. And a lot of people said, hey, you're going to show this information to the MTA, right? And they really wanted me to share it with them. And so I said, I'll do what I can, and I have tried. One thing that I kind of noticed when I was transcribing some of the focus groups were that the focus groups that had at least one person with a disability, I had a question about, like, do you ever kind of witness other people experiencing transportation challenges, difficulties, obstacles, any problems when they're trying to get around? Well, didn't matter what kind of disability they had, they would talk about elevators, other accessibility issues. When there wasn't someone with a disability in the group, they would kind of talk about other people experiencing the same things that they were experiencing. So they would say, oh yeah, well, if we're all stuck on the same train that's delayed. Yeah, we're all suffering. So I think there's still like some awareness that's missing. So I have a few ideas for improvements for the full study. So like I said, I want to provide Gmail accounts for participants. I think that would make some of the onboarding process a lot easier. It's better for anonymity because it won't be connected to their identity at all, and will probably make people feel more comfortable participating in this kind of study. I would have more control over the data, eliminate the tech challenges, and I could automate downloading. So I'm planning to incorporate the focus group feedback, but I also want to add some survey questions about housing and transportation satisfaction and quality of life, and also improve the visual design of the mobility report. So next steps, what I'm going to be really busy with this summer, I'm working on a literature review for my dissertation, and I'll give you a little preview of what I've found so far, and also my proposal. I'm also planning to do kind of a quasi-experimental study using the same methods with people with disabilities, and also doing like a survey to better understand transportation difficulties and informational technology access for people with disabilities. Because there's, in some of the literature I've been reading, informational barriers are pretty powerful barriers. So if people can't get the info they need about how to get where they want to go, they may just not try. And, we kind of assume that most people have smartphones these days, but there are a lot of people living, below poverty that have disabilities that may not have access to that technology. So some of the literature reviews that I found, I'm kind of going forward with this idea of self-determination and transportation. So basically, self-determination is the ability to do what you want to do with your life. And I feel that transportation really plays a big role in self-determination. And so these authors, Desi and Ryan, have developed a framework called self-determination theory. And one of their meta-theories is the basic psychological needs theory. And it says that, if for us to be able to do what we want to do, we need to feel autonomous, we need to feel related to other people, and we need to feel competent in what we're doing. And so trying to figure out how we can provide those things to people is what I'm interested in learning. And there's not really a lot of literature out there about transportation with people with disabilities, but what I'm finding does relate a lot to this. And there are ways to provide supports for these basic psychological needs. And the thing I like about their theory is that this isn't, motivation is not something that just comes from within the person. There has to be support for it. So, in the literature, I've kind of identified things that either, thwart autonomy or support it. So access barriers are going to limit people's autonomy, a lack of mode choice, financial barriers, dependence on others, sometimes low expectations of teachers, caregivers, parents, that, this person can't get around on their own. That definitely limits someone's autonomy. And these, the factors that support autonomy are not like a direct opposite of those. Sometimes they are, but sometimes there's other supports like a mobile device that can give security to the individual trying to get around, but also to the caregivers because they know that they can contact them or find them if something happens. For relatedness, some of the problems I'm seeing are, reluctance to seek help by individuals, especially people with communicative disabilities, a lack of transit employee support and awareness, this kind of separation or segregation of facilities, so putting passengers with disabilities in a separate form of transportation, whether it's a school bus or paratransit, those things can really affect our social development. And then, visible physical differences can change the way that strangers interact with you. But if we want to support relatedness, we need to, improve our community and social supports. A lot of studies that I found have experimented with group travel training to teach people of all ages how to get around on their own. Some are teaching older people who have basically driven their whole lives and now suddenly can't drive anymore, and they've never used public transportation in their life. But doing these kind of group outings and teaching them how to use buses for the first time has been very effective. And this is happening in New Jersey. Transit employee support and awareness. Of people with disabilities, I think a lot of people just don't really know how to interact or know what to look for or know how to help people. Inclusion and equality are really important factors that support relatedness, and also respect is probably one of the most important ones. And as far as competence goes, a lack of navigation skills and transportation experience can make people feel like they're not able or competent enough to travel independently. But also a lack of access to information can make them feel like they are not competent to travel independently, fear of unknown places. Also the low expectations of transit employees and members of the public, maybe someone assuming somebody else needs help, that can diminish feelings of competence. But if we want to support competence, we need to provide travel training and skill development, multiple modes of information development, and travel companions actually support skill development until people become comfortable enough to do it on their own. So that's what I'm finding so far, and yeah, that's most of my research till this point. And so now I'll talk a little bit about advocacy work and kind of what I see as the future of accessible transit in New York City. So as I mentioned before, like this is a graphic I designed. I got involved last year with the Rise and Resist Elevator Action Group, which was formed roughly a year ago. I think it was like April of last year. And Rise and Resist is actually a Trump resistance organization, and they have a lot of different working groups that are basically just trying to fight all these oppressive changes that are coming from our presidential administration. And so elevators don't really have much to do with that, but this is a civil rights issue that has never really been fully addressed and has been kind of, pushed aside for almost 30 years since the ADA was passed. So I designed this graphic for one of our early events that was co-sponsored with Transit Center, which is a public transportation advocacy organization. And they released a report called Access Denied last July. And so I kind of had this idea because, a lot of disability advocates for a long time have been saying, a lot of people need elevators. It's not just people with wheelchairs. There's, moms with strollers, people with luggage. All these people also use the elevators. So stop pinning it on us. Like we all need this. So we should just put in the money and make it happen. And so since July, this was this kind of first launch event for Access Denied. We've been doing rally after rally after rally. They've closed down or are closing down 19 stations in the subway to renovate without putting in any elevators. So this is happening throughout New York City, in Brooklyn and Queens. Currently on the Upper West Side, they just closed a station on 86th Street yesterday morning for repairs. It's not going to get an elevator. It's pretty clearly in violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Federal Transportation Authority has also issued their opinion about it and said that this is not our recommendation. We think that the law is pretty clear that you should be putting elevators in these stations when you renovate them. So yeah, we've just been showing up and trying to put public pressure on because that's really the way to make change happen, to try to affect those macro layers. You have to understand who controls the levers of power. And right now, the levers of power are controlled in Albany for the New York City subway. So Governor Cuomo is in charge of the MTA, even if he doesn't always admit to it. He's basically the decider. He gets to have final say on any budgets or money that gets spent. As a result of our advocacy, we got to have a subway ride with, this is Andy Byford, he's the New York City Transit president. And so we went on a subway ride with him a couple of months ago to kind of point out not just accessibility issues in terms of elevators and going inside elevators, seeing the conditions of the elevators, but also other accessibility issues like signage, not being able to hear announcements. There's so many problems. We started a crowdsourced document to kind of start listing out the issues with subway stations, cars, platforms, station agents, subway conductors, bus drivers, bus stops. And it's almost 8 pages long now because there's so many problems that need to be fixed. So he was very supportive. He said he was already kind of on our team and we were preaching to the choir when we were taking him on this ride, but nevertheless, we showed him a few new things. And he released his corporate plan a few weeks ago called Fast Forward. And this is a broad-reaching corporate plan to modernize the whole New York City transit. So that's not only the subways, but also the buses and paratransit. And so I'm going to show you another video where he talks about how he sees the New York subway. I'm going to grab this mic.
Sometimes, to truly appreciate a place, it helps to be from somewhere else. I visited New York many times in the past because I just can't resist this greatest of cities. And as someone that inherently believes in public transit, I've never owned a car, riding the New York subway is worth traveling thousands of miles for. I've been on subways all over the world. There's just nothing like New York. New York led the way over 100 years ago. And it grew quickly into one of the world's great transit systems, inspiring every subway in the world that followed with its innovations. And to me, the bus network is equally amazing, both in terms of scale and the sheer number of people it carries every day. New York leads the way, as it often does. Even when things weren't so good for transit in the city, it persevered. Because New York is just renowned for the way it stares down a crisis, its legendary ability to triumph over adversity. I live in New York now. I love the place, and I ride the subway every day to work. And I still feel the same way I did when I was just a tourist, complete and utter awe for this transit system and this city. I'm Andy Byford, and I'm the president of MTA New York City Transit. We know the transit system today isn't what it should be. It's not what a world-class city like New York deserves. So on behalf of my 50,000 fellow employees, we're making a promise to you today, and we want you to hold us to it. Our plan is called Fast Forward. We're going to transform the subway. We're going to reimagine the bus network. We're going to accelerate accessibility. And we're going to engage and empower our employees to provide outstanding customer service. Because New York deserves world-class transit that is fast, reliable, and accessible. And because doing nothing is not an option, but we can't do it alone. We'll need the commitment and support of our partners in government at the city, state, and federal levels. But most importantly, we ask for your patience and understanding as we do the necessary work to bring your transit system back. So please read our plan and let us know what you think. I'm incredibly proud to have been given the honor of running New York City Transit. I look forward to seeing you out there on the system soon.
I don't know if you noticed any similarities to my own video, but when I watched them both together, I was like, this is a little, I don't know. There's some eerie similarities with the piano music and the aerial photos of New York City. I just thought that was interesting. So yeah, that's, he's got a plan. It's ambitious. He wants to put in 50 new elevator stations in the next 5-year capital plan and 100 stations in the 5 years after that. But as of right now, it's words on paper, and we need the money to back it up. And so we can't really stop protesting, and we can't really stop putting pressure on our elected officials. And we try to get in the news and try to bring more awareness to the issue, and we're going to keep doing that. So so vote, please. All right, that's my presentation. Thank you. And now if we have questions, since we're live streaming, just want to make sure people speak into the mic. So I'll bring this up.
Mic runner. Is this on?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay. Firstly, thank you for a great presentation. I actually put in a shout out to the Transit Oriented Teens group on Facebook, and you've gotten a bunch of heart reacts.
Nice.
So,
thank you.
coming, I guess, from my own perspective, doing documents access for people with cognitive disabilities, I actually presented about that here last year.
I saw that. Yep.
Oh, awesome.
I was here.
Two things I was wondering. Firstly, have you looked at some of the have you looked at, or are you planning to look at some of the challenges with navigating the system, particularly maps, signage, and then when outages occur or delays occur, how that gets communicated, because there have been a number of high-profile cases with adults with cognitive disabilities basically getting stranded in other boroughs, in New Jersey, in different counties on the Metro North, and was wondering how you were planning to address that, particularly given that it surveying people with cognitive disabilities usually requires different survey methodologies from people who are not people with cognitive disabilities.
Right.
And then the other question was, I was wondering if you were planning to look at the intersection of language access and disability, particularly given that so many people with disabilities in New York and in the Northeast also not only are limited English proficient, but also after they retire out of the workforce often lose much of their English because they're often in particularly Russian or Spanish-speaking communities or Yiddish-speaking communities, and the signage is often lacking. The Yiddish signage for the MTA is written in a dialect of Yiddish that no Hasidic group actually uses on a day-to-day basis, for example. So I was wondering if you were planning to incorporate that and how you were planning to do that.
Yeah, so I think there's, I'll answer your second question first, because I think there's a lot of overlaps with accessibility, and I think language is something that I'm really interested in, because I only speak English, and I speak a little bit of Spanish, but this is really my first language, and I know what it's like to go to a foreign country where there's virtually no English spoken and how isolating it can feel, and I feel like there is a lot of overlap of design changes we can make that would benefit both of those populations, people with cognitive disabilities and people with language barriers, but also just regular people. I mean, I think partly because of my upbringing, being driven around, I have serious navigational difficulties. Like, I still get lost. Google Maps has kind of really changed the way I get around, because, I can only get so lost if I can see my blue dot on the map. So yeah, it's definitely an interest of mine. So I'm gonna, if I'm doing surveys, I'm definitely want to translate into a few other languages so I can get more people to participate. I don't think that I can personally change the design of the subway stations. I mean, I would love to do that, and I have some ideas for doing that. But I think for now, it's gonna have to kind of rely on mobile technology. I think can play a big role. I've been talking to Peggy Gross, who was basically in charge of travel training for adolescents with cognitive disabilities for New York City Public School District 75 for 40 years. And so she's just been a wealth of information with ideas about how to do research with people with cognitive disabilities and also to understand what their needs are. So I'm definitely looking at travel training as part of my research, and she's got a lot of stuff that's currently not digitized, like reports that she did in the 70s and 80s that I'm gonna try to get my hands on and actually make a resource out of. So yeah, it's definitely something that I'm considering. So I would love to talk to you more about it and as I develop my research, if you're interested. Yeah, great, thank you.
Hey, we already know each other. So this is sort of like a general question for you and also for other folks in the room to think about. What would your suggestions be for able-bodied and people with disabilities working together in the community to make sure that accessibility actually happens? Because more often than not, that most of these communities are not intersectional, and disability is often forgotten. And, I always bring up, number one, I've only been an amputee 4.5 years. And number two, not everybody stays healthy and able-bodied for their entire lives. And so we have to think about the future with it. But also we should just be human beings with each other. Mm-hmm. And so how can we better work together as a community, recognizing that it's the right thing to do? Yeah,
I don't have all the answers to that question. I'm trying to do my part. Even I have an invisible disability that's kind of like a sometimes disability. So I'm kind of straddling the line of disability. So, and most people perceive me as a disabled or not, a non-disabled person, and a lot of times I think I get the, oh, you're just a savior person coming in. So I think there's definitely needs to be more awareness. And I think part of the problem of having people primarily being, driven around in paratransit because they can't use the subway is a huge problem, because if we actually saw people with disabilities in our daily lives walking down the street in the real representation of our population, I think people would be a lot more aware just from that.
Instead of getting stared at and pictures taken and
Yeah.
people stopping traffic when you're walking by,
Right.
which happens every single day.
Yeah, it happens to,
Me.
Yeah, and it's happened to my friends. I totally am aware of that. I think, I don't know how to reach people who are not disabled and this is not on their radar, other than trying to get this message out in the media, other than trying to share my experiences, my knowledge, signal boosting other people's experiences. I don't, Twitter is like, not everyone's on Twitter, but, I try to retweet anytime I hear about someone experiencing just a horrific accessoride or any kind of other transportation related issue, getting stuck in a subway because the elevator's broken, having to get carried out by firefighters. This stuff happens on a daily basis, and most people are not aware. I think I was not really aware before, I kind of had this third relapse that kind of really started to affect my motor functions. And I was kind of out of work for a couple of weeks. And then, after that, I sprained my ankle, and then that just made it worse. And just this awareness, I think, unfortunately, doesn't happen unless it affects somebody personally, unless they know someone. Am I going to take a baseball bat around and start breaking people's legs so they become more aware? No. But I think we just need to boost the message and try to get it out there as much as possible. Yeah.
Thank you. So I noticed you use Google Maps as a part of your methodology, which is map applications in general are pretty notoriously inaccessible for blind and low vision users. I was wondering what sort of workarounds you were using or plan to use to get around that, to incorporate the experiences of blind and low vision people in your study.
Right. So, I did have one blind person in my pilot study, and she was the one of the few people that had difficulties with doing some of the maps, editing of modes, and downloading the files and uploading them. So for the future phase, I'm going to be providing people with a Gmail account, so potentially they wouldn't really have to interact with Google Maps at all. She didn't have problems with the PACO survey, so I guess she could enlarge it or use it. So I'll be using kind of the data from that about the modes of transportation that was used to verify in maps what kind of modes people are using. But yeah, if people have other ideas for making maps more accessible on mobile for screen readers, I would be all ears. Thomas has one.
I've got a blog post about that.
Oh, you do? Oh.
It's one of my passions.
I need to add that to my RSS feed or something. We'll talk more, but it's definitely something that I'm trying to work out. Yeah.
I had a question since I've got the mic conveniently. So for the data on the elevators, the stations that do, ignoring the ADA, just the ones that have been chosen by the city to get elevators, do you know what data attributes the city uses to make that determination?
So this, basically right now, they're about 13 stations shy of meeting this 100 key station agreement that they decided shortly after the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, or during the negotiations for that. So any news you hear in the next 2 years where it's like, oh, Astoria Boulevard is getting an elevator, yay, our advocacy is working, it's actually because they agreed to do it 30 years ago and they're just now getting around to it. not to be a downer on or say that advocacy doesn't work, but we can't really take credit for those at this point. They did improve or increase some of the current capital budget to add even more stations that were not part of that plan, but I think it's only 5 new elevators or 5 new stations, and they're not really sure which ones are going to get what. Andy Byford has told us, or he said in his plan, that he plans to prioritize areas where there's not enough coverage of elevators. So his goal for the next 5-year plan with these 50 new stations would be to have no more than 2 station distance to an accessible station. But there's a lot of issues that he also needs to work out in terms of elevator maintenance, because they break down really too frequently. The kind of notifications when an elevator breaks down is not automated. So it basically takes someone discovering that the elevator is broken, calling in and reporting it, and then someone putting it on the website for that information to be updated. So they also need to have a real-time kind of elevator status system so that it's actually usable, because if you tell people like, oh, hey, look, now there's all these new stations with elevators, like, go see the world. The first time that they encounter a broken elevator or get stuck in a subway station, that's going to really deter them from trying to use it again.
And you were saying that one of the mitigations now is to call the fire department, and that's the
that happens. The police, Dustin Jones, he's the founder of United for Equal Access and involved in a lot of other campaigns. He jokes that if you want to meet the New York Police Department or New York Fire Department, ride the subway in a wheelchair, because there's a good chance that they're going to have to come carry you out, because if there's not another accessible station anywhere nearby, you don't have a lot of options. So that's the unfortunate reality for people.
So I'm curious if you got enough data in order to slice it by different transit methods and different systems, because New York transit system has kind of a lot going on. The subway system is really 3 subway systems. The bus system is across 5 boroughs and has all kinds of different weirdness going on. So I'm curious if you noticed anything that were drastically different about the bus system in Manhattan versus the subway system in Brooklyn or something like that.
I don't think I have enough data to really look at it at this point, because I only had 20 participants. I haven't done enough of the quantitative analysis yet, just because the data quality was kind of mixed, and there was some missing data. So I'm trying to kind of work on some analysis plans just using what I have, but I wouldn't really feel comfortable reporting that back right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'll join the crowd, eagerly awaiting you doing loads more research.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if I need to kind of shrink my study area too, and just make it only people that use public transit or something like that, because when you throw in cars and other things, it's I don't know what I'm really comparing. So things I need to think about. Yeah.
Here I come.
Now, we're just going to go back to your point about being stuck in a subway. I've been stuck in a subway 3 times. And they took an hour and a half to come and get me. And to carry this chair out, my chair is 200 pounds. 6 guys had to carry it out, plus carrying me. So that's 8 people. So even that is that deters us from taking the trains.
Yeah.
Buses, when their ramps get broken, we get stuck on there. So I understand what's going on with this, but in a personal view, I'm glad that you are doing something like this, because it's really helping us out.
Thank you. And I hate hearing stories like that. I just have to say, because it's I just can't. Yeah, it's unimaginable for most people, and at the same time, they don't know that this is happening every day. So it's really. Yeah, it's unreported. There's the MTA doesn't really do research on how many people are getting injured, for instance. They keep track of how many people die in the subway, but that's about it as far as incidents, right? So if they started tracking it, that would be a news story that might wake people up. Yeah.
You talked about the problems with Access-a-Ride and delays and so on. I mean, everybody knows we have Lyft and Uber and so on, where you can call it and you can see a little car making its way towards you. Have they introduced any of this kind of stuff to this?
So, sort of. Iman can probably talk more about it. They are doing a pilot with a taxi app called Curb, where the people can request a ride, but it's a pilot at this point, and they're not rolling it out.
Yeah, they started a pilot in November. So I work at the New York Lawyers for the Public Interest doing disability justice work. I also have been using Access-a-Ride for 8 years. It has improved a little bit, like they give you a call reminder and emails, which they never used to do because their assumption was you guys aren't using emails. What do you need an email for? Which, whatever. And most recently, they started the on-demand Curb app, which came out of meetings that they had with our coalition, affectionately called ARG, Access-a-Ride Reform Group. Yeah, and they like to take credit for it, starting the Curb app, but they weren't even actually thinking about it until they had meetings with us. So that was great. And it's awesome, except if you live in an outer borough. There aren't that many cabs out there. And just, to put it in perspective, I live all the way out in Throgs Neck in the Bronx. There aren't that many curbs out there. So sometimes I'm waiting for 10 minutes. There was one morning I waited 2.5 hours. And so if you have a full-time job, that doesn't work. If I worked anywhere else other than NOPE, my ass would have been fired. Like, that's just real. And they're not thinking that people who have disabilities have college degrees, have jobs, have lives. I have siblings I want to see. I have a boyfriend. Like, I want to have a life. And booking your life a day or two in advance doesn't work for you. But using an on-demand app that isn't really on-demand also doesn't work. Even in Midtown, there was a time I was going out for my friend's birthday on a Friday. Our office is on 30th Street, and it took me an hour and 25 minutes to get a ride. Why? Because there weren't that many rides. Well, then make it that way. Like, make them have more rides. And I think, unfortunately, the MTA put out a low bid. Uber and Lyft weren't going to take it. And so this new company, Curb, took it. And it's a company that doesn't even have a Twitter page. So it's like, okay, you guys aren't that technologically savvy, whatever. But like, hey, MTA, put out a little more money, because guess what? You get federal money to have a paratransit service that works. So what are you doing with this federal money that's coming to make paratransit better? And I honestly think they're just putting it in their pockets. And we pay for it, by the way.
Right.
Access-a-Ride's not free.
Right.
We pay full price. We don't get any discounts. We don't get any buy 10 rides, get 2 free. We don't get any of that. And so not only is the MTA inaccessible, and we can't take advantage of the buses and trains that are there, the paratransit service is extremely expensive. And so a couple of months ago, I tallied it up, and I spent $450 in 1 month. Going and coming to work, going to meetings, and hanging out, just living my life. And I don't understand how that is considered fair simply because I'm an amputee. Because first of all, I didn't ask for this shit. Sorry. I cuss a lot. I have to deal with that. Well, I'm an amputee. I didn't ask for it. I didn't sign up for it, but it happened. It's here. I rock it, whatever. Don't punish me for something that I had no control over and that I'm living my life and trying to get through. It's just not fair, and it's not right, and that's not what Jesus would do. There you go.
And on top of that, Access-a-Ride costs the MTA between $70 and $75 per ride. And it's a shared ride service, so I don't know how this is happening. If they wanted to switch over to an Uber type of system today, they also have to think about the 1,400 paratransit vehicles that are operated by 14 separate transportation companies and all of the drivers involved. So I think that it's kind of turned into a huge mess. They should have been kind of working on accessibility of the whole system all this time, but they made a decision, it'll be cheaper for us to just drive people around, and so we're not going to bother with elevators. And so that's kind of been their MO up until now. But I think, this new transit chief kind of gets it and understands that it needs to happen. But like I said, he needs monetary support to make it happen. So Yeah.
All right.
I also wanted to mention that I'm sharing these slides if anyone wants to access them later. This bit.ly link, bit.ly/A11y hyphen capital JUNE 2018. And I even added alt tags to all my images to be extra accessible.
Awesome. I think we have time for one more question, and Sarah had her hand. Oh, awesome. Here I come.
I don't really have like any question, but it's just probably my research. So my name is Prince. I'm doing my internship in New York here. I'm from Purdue University. So last year, a project I did was I designed a mobile application and sort of a service for a visually impaired woman in Ireland. So it was a project that I collaborated with the engineering department. So I'm bringing this up because you mentioned about data collection and how you can kind of track the number of disabled people who board the trains and also the subways. So
Okay.
yeah, so Christina, we designed this for Christina. She's in Ireland and she's visually impaired. And what she's able to do, she's able to navigate her way through to the bus station. But when she gets to the bus station, you know, you get a lot of people all over there, and it's hard for her to be recognized. So what we thought was, if we could make the signages over there digitized in such a way that when she gets to the bus station, she would click the mobile app and just notify the system that this person is on this route or this route, and she's supposed to, the driver or the bus in the mate in the car can be able to identify her. So from there, it was hard for we're trying to collaborate with the Ireland busing system for this project, but they just weren't interested. So
Well,
continuously,
please-
some
yeah.
of these things are challenges that you
Please
go through.
email me. I would love to hear more about the project.
Yeah, but finally, when we designed it, they came for it and they've adopted it. Currently, they are working on developing it, and what I learned from it was that advocacy in such areas and the fact that people have to take the steps. That's why I really appreciate the work you're doing. And for me, my father was a stroke patient for 15 years. That was when I was 10 years. So all my life, you know, I've been living with I was living with a disabled man. So I'm very passionate about it. And your question about how we can all try to involve people in, you know, how we can bring people together to kind of advocate for some of these. I think in our various endeavors, we should preach about empathy, right? Because it's really critical. You don't necessarily have to be in the position to be able to understand. You can think with people. You can see in your mind eye about how people, the kind of trouble or situation they go through. Then I mean, you can also help and take steps towards that. So that's my motivation for coming here this evening, and I really appreciate it for you guys. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, and an awesome note to end on, I think, at that point. Thank you so much, Jessica, for presenting.
Thank you.
It was awesome. And thank you to Thoughtbot for hosting us. This is fantastic. And we'll have our next meetup next month. Thank you so much. And we have a little bit of time to hang out here and chatter if you have some other questions. But we will start kicking people out not too long in the future. So with that, thanks so much. Have a good night.
Thank you. Also, if you want to get your own Elevators Are For Everyone t-shirt, you can buy it on riseandresist.org.